Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Laurel.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's session of REB West, which is called National Harmonization. Where are we now? And it also is where are we going? So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the session today. I was told that I don't, sorry, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded ancestral territory of the Tsawwassen First Nation in BC. It's the sunniest region in BC's lower mainland. And unfortunately, although we have sun out today, it's still waiting for summer. I'm Laurel Evans. I'm the Director of Research Ethics at UBC. I was told I don't need to give everyone's bios, the people that are speaking on the panel with me. And so I'm just going to very briefly make a couple of notes on the individuals that are here, all of whom are just awesome people and people that I've known in research ethics for many, many years. I'll start with myself, and the big news is that I was looking it up yesterday, and I found out that this year, 2022, is my 20th anniversary of my of this part of my career, which is the part that's in research ethics. And I don't even want to tell you that I had a whole career before that. So that makes me fairly old, but very wise. I'd like to tell you that Hanan Abdel-Akher, who's our first speaker, is a senior policy analyst with the Secretariat and responsible conduct of research. And the interesting, or not just the only interesting, but one of the most interesting things about her is that she has a master's degree in public ethics from the University of Ottawa and from the University of St. Paul's, which means that compared to most of us in the room, she knows more about ethics than we did. Our next speaker is going to be Richard Carpentier. He's a principal investigator with the CIHR funded CHEER project that he's going to tell us about. One of his key contributions to research ethics, though, is that he was the executive director of what was called of National Council on Ethics in Human Research. Only those of you who've been in the business for quite some period of time will know that that was called NCARE. And NCARE was absolutely the first organization in Canada to offer quality improvement site visits to institutions with research ethics boards. So I think for Richard, things have come pretty much full circle. Stacey Beck is a senior consultant in systems development with the University of Calgary. And she's a product manager of REB Exchange, which is a platform that we will be talking about today. Stacey has some awesome technical skills, and those of us who worked with her are really, really amazed by her unstinting advocacy for making ethics harmonization work in Canada. She's a key player, even though she's not someone that is a research ethics administrator or board member. Susan Babcock, the next to last speaker, needs no introduction. Her biography says it all. She says she has an unhealthy fondness for policy work. She has very high tolerance for ambiguity and a good sense of humor. Susan combines irreverence and industriousness whenever possible. Plus, I happen to know that she enjoys a good glass of wine. Terry Fleming is also well known to all of you. She's going to be our final speaker. And as her biography says, she was instrumental in successfully implementing the BC Harmonization Initiative. What the biography does not tell you is that she took that job over from me because it was in a mess. And I was trying to dictate my way through to what I thought would be a successful outcome, and it was definitely not working. Terry took over along with Jean Ruiz and Sarah Bennett, and lo and behold, everything started to click because they started to listen to people who knew what they were talking about. So that's a brief intro for all of our panelists. So now getting down to just a brief intro for the session. I told Terry that I would be giving a brief history of the efforts that have been made in Canada to support national harmonization of research ethics. But I'm not going to bore you with stories of all the various reports, recommendations, committees, and ancillary binders that were filled up to make recommendations around developing a pan-Canadian approach to research ethics. The efforts go back as far as Richard and NCARE. So it's been a long journey. One of my presentations on the topic of the history of this topic, of this issue, features a picture of a very barren landscape covered in litter. And from my perspective, that is a snapshot of the history of what this issue. All the litter is all the reports and all the recommendations and all the CGSB standards and everything that we have put in to trying to make a national system for research ethics in Canada. And it's all really been blown away, basically. In order to make it successful, we would have had to have the support of the Tri-Councils of Health Canada and the institutions with REBs. That support would have involved allocation of funding and resources, and no one has been particularly interested in providing that kind of support up until now. It's important to note that all those reports and recommendations and proposals did not advocate for a single REB review by one designated REB. Most of them proposed hybrid types of solutions, including common governance and common or equivalent qualifications for research ethics boards that reviewed different types of studies, operating using the same standards, including the TCPS and common SOPs, with allowance for differences depending on the institutional context. And then a couple of things happened on the way to the current party. The first was the efforts made by virtually every province in Canada to establish some kind of provincial harmonization process. BC started on its journey way back in 2007, which is when I moved out to British Columbia. Alberta and Saskatchewan were working on the topic at the same time. Ontario's Clinical Trials Ontario started producing annual reports in 2012. So I don't know exactly when it started operating, but I would assume somewhere around there. And Quebec, although it had a false start, developed its processes for single REB review studies in 2015. And other provinces with smaller numbers of REBs have developed collaborative review processes that work within the context of their particular province. Most of the provincial efforts were fueled by a desire to be more competitive than other provinces in attracting industry-sponsored clinical trials. The outcome has resulted in more expeditious reviews of multi-center provincial health research, including to some extent investigator-initiated clinical trials, but it has not had much success in relation to industry clinical trials. They haven't been that impressed by our efforts. So where are we now? The CHEER initiative started work in 2020 to try to produce a collaborative approach to national streamlined ethics review of pediatric research. And then, as all of us know, the COVID-19 pandemic reared its ugly head, and the REBs were forced to adopt emergency procedures, alternate methods for conducting research, ethics review, and the results demonstrated in most cases that the REBs were definitely up to the task. Canada is a large country with a small geographically distributed population. Its population is roughly the size of California's. We have a relatively small number of REBs, particularly amongst those that review industry-sponsored clinical trials. It's very important, if we are to remain competitive within the research arena, that we spend the money and develop plans to coordinate review of studies on a multi-provincial level, not just in the research ethics realm, but also in contracts, privacy, institutional approvals, and a number of other areas. This does not mean that we need to take a knee-jerk reaction and jump into a solution of one REB review conducted by a lead board of record somewhere in the country, and a separate standalone platform. In the United States, and we've done some investigation on this, they have mandated single IRB review, as all of you know. And I have heard firsthand from Nichelle Cobb from AHARP that that 6 years into the single IRB rule requirement, first mandated by NIH and then by the US Common Rule, that imposition of the requirement has, first of all, increased the number of contracts, reliance agreements that the institutions have had to enter into. So it's lessened the work from the ethics board perspective, but increased it from the contracts perspective. And secondly, it has resulted in blowing apart, and those are her exact words, the established processes for ensuring institutional compliance with the Common Rule and other research requirements. And this has been done because it's delinked ethics approval from established research integrations within existing academic institutional research systems. Okay, so what does all this mean? Canada needs a pan-Canadian approach to ethical reviews of most multi-province research studies. The pan-Canadian approach, though, can't ignore or afford to bypass the established provincial harmonization processes, which are running smoothly and which provinces have invested millions of dollars into. Whatever the end process is, it also needs to integrate with institutional ethics review platforms that have been implemented by a number of institutions and provinces so that linkages with other compliance requirements are kept intact. Otherwise, there's no question there's going to have to be duplication of effort. So if local REBs are not a part of the approval process, they cannot and should not be part of the monitoring process. The responsibility would have to be offloaded to the institution, which has agreed to accept the review of an external REB. This effectively shifts the burden of ethical monitoring from the local REB to the institution, thereby not taking advantage of local research ethics board expertise. And this is something that, in my opinion, we should be avoiding if at all possible. The Canadian REB community, as you know, is relatively small. There are a limited number of institutions with robust online systems. Almost all of the provinces have a provincial harmonization process. And unlike in the United States, in Canada, we have the advantage of being able to work collaboratively and a history of working collaboratively, respecting each region's multi-regional, multi-jurisdictional processes to create a pan-Canadian ethical review process. So failing to take advantage of this opportunity, which has in fact developed over the past 10 years, in my opinion, would be a major mistake. It would result in a separate system required for national reviews, and it would require additional work for researchers and for research ethics board administrators. So that's my speech from the bandbox. I really believe in national harmonization, but I believe that it should be accomplished in a collaborative way, building upon the systems and the processes that are already out there, that are well established and that have cost the country and institutions literally millions of dollars. So that's my speech for the day. I'm now turning the pull over to Hanan, to Hanan, and I'm not even going to go with the last name this time. She's going to speak to us about the efforts of the panel on research ethics for streamlined or single review of minimal risk studies. Hanan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laurel. I appreciate this introduction. So today I will speak to you about very briefly about the outcomes of the, just to remind you about the public consultation that took place in 2021 I'll focus this on specifically on multi-jurisdictional ethics review. Next slide, please. So from June 15 to October 4th of 2021, the panel on research ethics held a public consultation, and it included consultation on 4 new documents. One was the exemptions for research involving human cell lines. The other is research involving totipotent stem cells, the broad consent for the storage and the use of data and human biological materials. And the one that we will be focusing on in this presentation is the review of multi-jurisdictional research. So we've heard we had received 69 sets of comments, and 64 of those were posted online, and they're available on the panel on research ethics website. So we heard from 14 individual, 14 of the 69 were actually from individuals, and 50 from organizations and groups. Next slide, please. So the fourth topic of this consultation, the review of multi-jurisdiction research, basically mandated the proposal was to mandate a single REB model for minimal risk multi-jurisdiction research, which may apply to more than minimal risk. It included operational details and procedures. It defined roles and responsibilities of researchers, of local REBs, and the reviewing REBs. Next slide. And what we we received a lot of comments from the community. So the review of multi-jurisdiction research was a very popular topic in this round of consultations. So almost 90% of the total comments that we received from the community had something to say about the topic. This represents 57 sets of comments from 13 individual researchers and 44 groups. And the groups represented one or multiple REBs or institutions. Sometimes it was a whole region. The comments themselves were quite detailed, and on each section of the draft guidance, I should say that we were quite impressed by the level of details and the thought and the effort that the community has put into their comments, whether in supporting the guidance or in raising issues or in making alternative suggestions for our consideration. So it was clear in the comments that everyone agrees that streamlining REB review is worthwhile and important. So that's what everyone agreed on. It was also evident that the community is divided on the proposed topic, proposed guidance. On the one hand, we had researchers' submissions that support the guidance. And on the other hand, we had the majority of the group submissions, most of whom were REBs. They expressed reservations, and they provided detailed comments, as I said, that suggest the need for major revisions or highlighted many of the barriers to the implementation of the guidance that was proposed. So next slide, please. This is the what we received from some of the comments that we had received from researchers expressing strong support for the guidance that we have provided, and I'll let you read through this. Next slide, please. And here are excerpts from comments, mainly from REBs expressing the reservations about the proposed guidance. I'll let you also read through this. So next slide, please. For the issues that were raised in the feedback from the communities, some reflect implementation issues, and others seemed to result from confusion about the intent of the guidance. And perhaps this is an opportunity to clarify this. So some of the comments suggested that the proposed does not take into account local regulations and legislation that may not permit the assignment of a board of record outside the designated REB. In fact, the TCPS already recognizes in the application of Article 8.1 that legislation exists in some provinces and that it would supersede alternative REB review models. There are clear statements in there. Another point is that some of the commenters expressed concern that the proposed would replace existing agreements and collaborations and the efforts that that Laurel was referring to. Honestly, this was not the intent of the proposed guidance. The guidance was intended to fill gaps where none exist. Other comments also questioned the focus of the proposed guidance and viewed what we proposed or what the panel proposed as a shift away from the participant protection focus of the TCPS. And actually the intent of the guidance was to maintain participant protection while reducing the unnecessary duplication that result in delays for the conduct of research and delays that would have of research that would have benefit participants. And then there were comments, many comments were concerned about the level of operational details that the guidance gets into and the implementation aspects that may not necessarily meet the needs of all REBs and all contexts and at all institutions. Next slide, please. So we heard you, and we've gone through all the detailed comments with a fine-tooth comb. And so here's the current thinking on how to move forward with the guidance. As you know, we currently have 3 alternative models in the application of Article 8.1 that allow institutions to accept each other's reviews or to accept external reviews from other REBs. The plan is actually to introduce a 4th model of a single REB review that is limited to minimal risk research. So like the other models, this new model would be optional. Institutions and REBs would be strongly encouraged to adopt the new model in the absence of other existing models. The scope of the new model, as I said, is limited to REB review of minimal risk multi-jurisdiction research, where it is not anticipated that the duplication of review would contribute to greater participant protections. We propose in this model that the lead principal investigators REB would confirm that the research is in fact of minimal risk. So someone has to take on this responsibility, basically. The new model would be exempt from the requirement for an official agreement as compared to the other models. That this requirement still remains for the other alternative models. And the expectation is that the REBs would develop their own procedures on how to manage and implement this new model. So under this model, basically, all REBs would delegate the ethics review to one REB. The reviewing REB must be affiliated with an eligible institution. As you know, all eligible institutions are subject to the same agency policies and procedures. And other REBs would basically fulfill their responsibility by accepting and documenting such acceptance of the ethics review done by the reviewing REB. Next slide, please. So why we think that this will work and what why we think that this would be there are benefits to this proposed model. So the new model focuses on principles that support participant protection while removing the unnecessary impediments and the duplication that's not anticipated to add any participant protection. The new model also will not get into any operational details. It will give the institutions the flexibility in implementing the model in a way that meets their needs and depending on the context. And it is optional. It does not interfere with provincial legislation that require a designated REB, for example. It also would not replace any other streamlining initiatives or harmonization initiatives that institutions have already established and have put all the time and effort and resources into it. The proposed model, basically the new model, will be strongly encouraged where such streamlining or harmonization efforts do not exist. Next slide, please. Perhaps the main highlight related to this new model is that it removes the requirement for official agreements. And this has been, as you know, an unnecessary barrier for collaboration, especially for the ethics review of minimal risk research. It also recognizes that there have been many development and streamlining efforts in the community since the release of the second edition of the TCPS in 2010. And as a matter of fact, what Laurel had mentioned, that goes back to many years ago, and now many REBs actually collaborate and have experience working together, and they have established trust, and they communicate with each other formally and both formally and informally. So this new model basically builds on this established trust amongst REBs and institutions. Next slide, please. There's a benefit also. We thought about, okay, well, should we put this the proposed model first and test it with the community in an interpretation perhaps, and see if the community is willing to accept it or not. And we felt that there is a benefit for incorporating the new model actually in the policy guidance itself. It will it can still be supported by a public interpretation, but it gives it weight, and it would be ready for the community to adopt it right away. And the new model is also consistent, and it supports the proportionate approach that exists in the TCPS that directs the most intensive scrutiny, time and resources, and the most participant protections to the most ethically challenging research. So this fourth model is limited to REB, as you know, review of minimum risk research. So we're not expecting a lot of, we're not expecting that there will be resistance to its adoption, and as I always remind myself of what minimal risk research in the TCPS, I think it would be useful to remind ourselves of the definition of minimal risk in the TCPS, which basically I'll just read it from the TCPS itself. It's defined as research in which the probability and the magnitude of possible harms implied by participation in the research are no greater than those encountered by participants in those aspects of their everyday life that relate to the research. And I should say that we did present this to the CARIB. We did present a similar deck to the CARIB group at the CARIB conference, I mean, in April, and there was support for anecdotal support for what we have suggested here. So we are hoping that this will receive support from the community, but there is also a desire to assess the effect of this guidance. We hope that this is a phased approach, so this is part of a phase, and we want to get information on whether this was useful for the community, and whether there's a need for more, or how it was implemented within the community. So the plan is actually to assess what you currently have. So most likely it will be released in with the before or at the same time as the release of the new guidance. And the idea is to assess this in a couple of years from now and compare the results and take it from there, basically. So stay tuned for such a survey that will be sent to the research community in the near future. And next slide, please. So it's the next slide, following slide. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your interest in participating in this and welcome any comments or questions that you may have. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Hanan. That was awesome. And when did you say you thought that it was going to start to be implemented?
Yeah, so we are at a stage that, and I'll explain some of the process that we go through, actually. So basically, the panel is recommending the revisions for the 4 documents to the agency. So we're almost done with this process, this stage. So, and there is an internal process within each of the 3 agencies so that they're approved by councils of the 3 agencies and then the 3 presidents. So this will take place, we expect, in the fall of this year. And then once this is approved, then it will come back to us for translation and posting and release to the community. So we expect this to happen in winter 2023.
Okay, that's good to hear. Okay. We're going to hold the rest of the questions till the end of the session. We have allocated a fair amount of time to be available to ask questions of all of the speakers. So I'm now going to pass the baton on to Richard Carpentier, who's going to tell us a little bit about the CHEER platform and program. And we welcome him here. He's standing in Susan Marlin's stead, and I'm sure he'll be a great replacement. Richard.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll try to fill in for Susan, who knows much more about the minutiae details. So I want to talk to you today about the CHEER project, which is the Canadian collaboration for child health, efficiency, and excellence in the ethics review of research. So next slide. I have no conflict of interest to declare. Next slide. Okay, so this project was funded by is funded by CIHR, and they wanted to explore the possibility of working across Canada with a single review by a board of record, and we'll go more deeper into that. They thought that by working with child health researchers who have a long-standing interest in streamlining research ethics review, it might make things easier to test. In the case of child health researchers, studies often require participants from multiple hospitals. And often in the case, for example, of rare diseases, it could be provinces, countries that provide data for a particular situation. So multiple reviews can lead to delays in starting studies and increased costs. We have heard of hours of studies that would take like 2 years and more to start, and that would never start because it was too long, because they had too many sites where they had to submit and submit changes and submit changes from changes to another site. So sometimes it is mind-boggling when you have a lot of sites. If you have 2 or 3, it's not bad, but if you have 20, and I know that the researcher at the Public Health Agency of Canada was working on a special disease, was working with almost all of the hospitals in the country. He was working with more than 200 hospitals. So that is mind-boggling when you're working like that. The other problem that the researchers are coming across is the variance in the research ethics review results, which make it difficult to have a single protocol. So the CHEER project aims at improving child health care in Canada by enhancing and expediting child health research, and especially the research ethics review part of it. So the funding opportunity comes from CIHR, and especially the Institute for Human Development, Child and Youth Health, and also the CIHR Institute on Genetics, because especially of those rare diseases where you need, they are basically genetically based, and they need to have a lot of participating sites to have cases and come to understand the disease. So next slide, please. So the collaboration, the CHEER is a collaboration between a lot of different institutions, especially Clinical Trial Ontario, MyCERN, and also Queen's University. It's a 5-year project, probably a 6-year because of COVID. We are going to be able to extend for another year. It does involve 35 collaborators and co-investigators across the country, 16 pediatric hospitals and research institute that are supporting the project, and this is one of the reasons why they wanted to work with pediatric, because you can work with a limited number of REBs or institutions. So that is 16 institutions instead of, I don't know how many would be involved for a very much larger study. It's all of the pediatric hospitals. It's only 16, so it's a manageable thing to do. Then we've got 23 research intensive networks that are supporting, and we do have working groups. We have 5 cross-Canada committees that we are working with. So the goal is to achieve a single research ethics review for multiple site child health studies in Canada. So the activities, and we'll come back to those, are basically three areas of activity. One, the development of an online platform. Second, REB assessment, that is called qualification. And third, education programs. And finally, of course, a report that will be provided to CIHR. So next slide, please. So the CHEER Research Ethics Education Program, we do have the development of online modules. So those are high quality, long lasting modules to support the ethical conduct of research ethics review of child health studies, covering 6 areas. So the participant assent and consent, study design, especially the new design that have come to be very prominent over the last 5 to 10 years. Participant recruitment, data management, and public and patient and public engagement, and also special topics that are going to be determined as we move forward. The content will be based on the complete research ethics education needs assessment. We have conducted that with more than 220 researchers and REB members, and content experts in a working group for each topic. Those are being formed right now and are starting to work. It's going to be a dynamic content with workshop, webinars, infographics, and other resources developed to address specific topics of health interest to the health side research and research ethics communities. And third, support for patient and family members on the REB. So the support, we do have a special committee headed by a person who has had her son involved in a lot of cancer trials. So she has been through everything, and she is really extraordinary parent. So support for patients or family members or community members on REBs. These are also special members on REBs because they come with no special preparation. Everybody, I think, who come on an REB has something to learn because they have not learned that at the university, how to review a protocol and how to work as an REB members. But community members are especially members that need to be brought on board and with a bit more a bit more adjusted educational material. So these module will be based on currently ongoing educational needs assessment interviews with REB members across Canada. So this is still ongoing. So next slide, please. So the goal, of course, is to come to streamline research ethics review in Canada. This is the goal of CIHR. So right now, our goal is to have one REB review used by multiple sites across Canada for child health studies, and the same review being used by local REB for a facilitated or delegated review. So it may be that at the beginning there is a number of sites that would recognize each other and recognize a board of record, and whereas there would be some other sites that would not participate immediately, and that would be using some of the material like a repository of documents, or would be looking at how the board of record would have looked at the material and do their own review. So that will be the first step. Then having one review for child health studies in Canada, and the goal of CIHR would be, down the road, and that may be, I don't know when. I don't think I will be there to see that, but one REB review for all studies. So that's their goal, if they can achieve it. Okay, so next slide, please. What do we need for a single REB review of multi-site study in Canada? We need federal legislative regulatory policy support. We need provincial legislative regulatory support, so no barriers. And we know that there are presently some legislation that preclude that from happening. We'll talk about that in a moment. We need infrastructure. We need a system. We need an REB qualification program. We need individual institutions to agree to allow delegation to external REB. We think that it's not REBs that are agreeing for external REB to review, but institutions. We need institution and study teams that are organized to support delegation to an external REB. We need research teams willing to engage, and they are mostly, as Hanan was exposing a few minutes ago, the research teams are there because they are the first beneficient of that. And then we need the patient and family support. So next slide, please. So in terms of support, there is the support of Health Canada, with we have been working a lot with them, and they are very supportive of that. The clinical trial regulations do allow for a single review. And we know that in the case of drug trials, for example, if you look at commercial or private or independent REBs, sometimes you could have a research that is done only, let's say, in family physician offices, and they would never go to a hospital REB, but they could be done by one independent private REB in the country, and then submitted to Health Canada. So that is something Health Canada do accept a single review for trials, of course, when it is appropriate. So CIHR and the CIHR is in agreement with that by the fact that they have funded Tier 2 pilot single REB review. And of course, there was the modification that was proposed to TCPS2 that was proposing that, although I think that there is a little bit of a change in what was proposed initially, but it's still in the same spirit. So next slide, please. So if you look from province to province, there are really 3 provinces where there are really legislative barriers to allowing review coming from outside of the province. So you will have Alberta, you will have Quebec, and you will have Newfoundland that really have strong legal barriers to that. And especially in the case of Quebec and Newfoundland, these were based on really egregious events that happened in the province, and that stood, some legislative action to preclude that from happening again. So that was the basis in Quebec. It did start, in fact, in 1998. The change to the civil code. In Newfoundland a bit later, when some physicians from the US ran away with some blood and data from Newfoundland. So they wanted that to, in Alberta, I don't know exactly if there was an event but what happened is that since there was no pan-Canadian initiative, I mean, there was at some time, and at some point there was none, each province, I think, took the rational decision to organize provincially their system to be more efficient, as Laurel was saying, and that is what has happened. In some cases, with some stronger limitations, like Alberta, Quebec, and Newfoundland. In other provinces, with some less stringent limitations, so that they can accept or they can collaborate with other provinces. So next slide, please. So in terms of infrastructure needed for a single review, there is a system, so the IT infrastructure to manage initial and ongoing compliant review across multiple sites. And that is a system that will be auditable, and that would satisfy the requirement of Health Canada or the FDA if they come and do an audit, so that everything would be in there. We have to have REBs that are ready and willing to provide a single review, and we do have proposed qualification as a mechanism to engender trust. And then templates agreements, where institution delegate to another institution the review of a particular research, or accept the review by another institution. So that is done through an agreement, and we do think it is the institution that has this legal power to do that, and not the REB. So next slide, please. I don't know what this slide is. It looks a bit weird to me. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, this slide is not coming out well. Yeah. Well, I think we can skip it, please, because yeah. So it comes like that. Oh, that's why. So just click and click and click. Yeah. So yeah, okay. So you've got there the on the left end, you've got the chair stream online system, and then you've got on top the REB qualification checklist, with some of the elements, and then at the bottom the top page of the chair research ethics board of record agreement. So those are documents that already exist and are in use. Okay, next slide, please. So for the delegation to be in place, you need to have the support of the senior leadership. You need to have internal policy that are revised as necessary, and processes in place to support an external REB review. So next slide, please. So now the institutional approval of a study is happening, of course, side by side. So you need to have, if I look where I am chair of the REB, we need to have the approval from the department in the hospital for the research. You need to have certification to do the research. We need to have, and then we do have the REB ethics approval, and that is for the institution. And next slide, please. So in what we are proposing, we do have one of the elements. Of course, the other elements do happen in the hospital or the institution. The only element that is external is the external ethics approval that is done for all of the institution, but you do also have internal approvals that are necessary. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this I have addressed a bit sooner. So next slide, please. Let's see where we are. Yeah, this is, I think I have addressed this. So let's go to the next slide, 17. So, I mean, this is basically, to wrap up, this is where we are. We are trying to have one REB review used by multiple sites, and also collaborative site that would participate and would collaborate by using what is provided by chair. And we want to go to one REB review for all child health studies. And finally, we know that when CIHR has given the funding opportunity, their goal was to eventually go to one REB review for all studies. So final slide, please. So we do want to acknowledge the work of the chair collaborators, the committees, the Operational Management Committee, the REB Advisory Committee, the Patient and Family Advisory Committee, and the Strategic Implementation Advisory Committee. We have also an Education Committee that seems to be missing there. We have supporters in hospital, in research and intensive networks, Health Canada, and also Children Healthcare Canada, and knowledge user, which are Health Canada, the Quebec Health Department, the Newfoundland and Labrador Health Research Ethics Authority, Children Healthcare Canada, and we want to thank the supporters, the funders, which are CIHR Institute for Human Development, Child and Youth Health, and also the CIHR Institute of Genetics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was an interesting presentation. And I was interested to notice that you're really talking about delegated and facilitated review only at this point in time. It had been my impression that you were well on your way to single REB review, and it appears that it's taking a little bit longer than had maybe been intended or proposed.
Well, because yeah, I mean, we are progressing. The qualification process is a process that is taking time, And so we've got one that is basically finishing. We've got a couple that are, you know, at diverse stages, and then we'll see where we go. We will have then 4 provinces that will be part of the system, and then we will go from there.
Okay. All right. Now, next, I'd like to turn the podium over to, again, we'll save the questions till the end, but I just do want to comment for the people in the audience that UBC is in the process of analyzing adoption of REB exchange, and we have endorsement from the 6 affiliated REB chairs at the university to move forward with it. And unless there's, and I'm told there's no technological challenges or barriers to it, so it does look like something that we will be moving forward with. And for those who are harmonized partners, we will be able to utilize this if we would like, but with partners who, as long as the study has one UBC REB involved in it, then the harmonized study can go the REBX route as well. So some of you may be encountering this in the future. Okay. Thank you, Stacey, again. Okay, next speaker is Susan Babcock, I believe, right? Susan, again, needs no introduction, and she's going to talk to us about institutional responsibilities and all sorts of other fun stuff. Susan.
Okay, it'll help if I unmute. Thank you very much for that introduction, Laurel. I love the fact that you think I need no introduction. I would, you know, I'd argue I'm probably a legend in my own mind, but all right. I hope that everybody can see my screen, and I'm certain somebody will let me know if you can't. Sorry, let me just move to a better view. All right, there we are. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this panel and to be talking to you today. I'm speaking to you from the University of Alberta, and sorry, I'm playing with, there we go. So I'm speaking to you from Edmonton and on behalf of the University of Alberta, and I want to respectfully acknowledge that my home and the University of Alberta are located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. I also need to say that this topic is big. I'm going to try and talk to you in 15 minutes roughly about multi-jurisdictional research, individual and institutional requirements. And there's a lot of material here, so I'm going to fly through it. I would also like to say that when I talk about academic research, I mean that to include the research that occurs in the health authorities and in hospitals. And so I'm talking fundamentally about the peer-reviewed, tri-agency funded and comparable sort of work that all of our institutions undertake and that our REBs review. So academic research is competitive, complex, interdisciplinary, multilateral, and increasingly scrutinized. And it is scrutinized by many, many people. We scrutinize, scholars scrutinize one another's work. The public scrutinizes our work more and more these days. And we have robust regulatory environments. And there is no question that the compliance burden for research has grown significantly over the past 30 years. And the more research we do, the more that burden will increase. So this slide gives you a snapshot of the way our landscape has changed in the last 30 years. It's hard to imagine, but there was a time when there were no ethics reviews for human participant research if outside of the medical realms. The TCPS came into place in 1998. We actually still have researchers at some of our campuses who remember the pre-TCPS days, right? So by any measure, our institutions, if you think of the growth of your institutions, the numbers of people, the kinds of money, the kinds of work we do, our research and our environments are significantly more complex and complicated now, and they are only going to become more complicated. Funder and legal requirements for research have soared, and there is very little recognition of the associated burden. I would also say there is very little recognition by institutions, including researchers, of the expertise needed to manage these institutional and researcher obligations. Academic research is big business, and management of that research and our accountabilities is part of that business. So let's for a minute look at tri-agency financial requirements or tri-agency requirements. And what I find really interesting about tri-agency is that all of the requirements that individual researchers and institutions fulfill are seen through and are presented through a financial lens. So the guide, the TAGFA on the left there, is what researchers get. That's what grant recipients are told to refer to. It doesn't actually talk about research ethics. It talks about the tri-agency framework for the responsible conduct of research, which in turn talks about research ethics. But it doesn't point, for instance, to the TCPS too. And then there's the agreement that institutions sign, and that's where we agree to develop policies and uphold standards that conform to the RCR framework, the TCPS, CCAC, and other things. And obviously, of course, we're all expected to, follow the law, provincial and federal. As we know, depending when and where researchers were trained, they may not understand current ethics requirements, and they may in fact not be aware of all of the other requirements and obligations related to the conduct of research. So it is absolutely no surprise that individual researchers are all in favor of single REB review, because individual researchers are fundamentally focused on advancing their individual research projects and goals, and up to and including care for their patients. I would, at the same time, the institutions, in order to maintain our tri-agency funding and to uphold our own policies and standards, we need to ensure that institutional accountabilities are adequately addressed. And so, it makes it, I always laugh when I hear people talk about, well, in the US, they have a single review. The US is built around an entirely different regulatory system. And the UK, well, they have a national ethics review process. Sure, they also have a national healthcare system. We don't have either of those things here. So the point around any form of ethics harmonization, like any form of research collaboration, these processes, these agreements have to advance research, and they have to serve institutional accountabilities, or they will not work. I think that's a pretty simple message. So not only is academic research big business, it is everybody's business. And so what I'm showing here on the slide is basically a reframing of some of those connections and integrations that Stacey Beck just talked about. So there's the REB in yellow. You can see in pink the tri-agency policies and frameworks that drive into our research. And we know that these are going to increase and be mutually reinforcing. I've put hospitals in a different color because sometimes for post-secondary institutions, hospitals are external, and sometimes the hospital is also the REB and the overseer of the research. I just want to give you a couple of notions around scale. The University of Alberta is currently obliged to be compliant with over 300 individual pieces of legislation and policy. Over a third of that applies to research. And I am confident this is true of every single one of your institutions. And I suspect the compliance burden is even higher for hospitals and health authorities. Another marker around the volume or the size of academic research, how big this is, U15 institutions alone account for $8.5 billion annually in research expenditures. So really, really big business, and we cannot ignore the business requirements associated with research administration when we talk about ethics harmonization. So given the way institutional research requirements have evolved, since 1992 or over the last 30 years. I arbitrarily picked that time frame. It's absolutely unsurprising that all of those requirements, that the institutional response has been to build very sophisticated processes that integrate these requirements so that they support one another. And whether ethics approval triggers other parallel processes, or whether ethics approval has to be in place for additional processes to follow, it doesn't matter. The point is that they're integrated. And Stacey, I think the REBEX slide deck speaks to that very, very, very eloquently. The key point here is that starting any human participant research project, whether it is single site standalone or multi-site, usually depends on more than REB approval, particularly if it is a health study. So I've talked a little bit about an institutional point of view and a researcher point of view. I think it's also really important to understand that there's a regional point of view, and this is not well understood. The research ecosystem in Western Canada is very different than the ecosystem in Eastern Canada. So for instance, in Western Canada, excluding the BC health authorities and hospitals represented here, and excluding cancer, because cancer studies tend to be a special case in every province, the majority of clinical research is administered by post-secondary institutions. In Eastern Canada, the majority of clinical research is administered by hospital REBs. And so for them, for those REBs, multi-jurisdictional clinical studies may in fact represent the majority of their business. But that is not true in Western Canada. And this has been one of the fundamental difficulties, is that when we talk about harmonization, our colleagues in the East are talking exclusively, predominantly, about clinical research, and we're trying to talk about all the work that we oversee. So speaking for the U of A, the Health Research Ethics Board that we administer oversees health research for all of Northern Alberta and the U of A, plus a couple of other institutions, including Alberta Health Services, so the northern part of our system. Altogether, as of this morning, we have about 5,325 active studies overseen by the U of A, and of those, about 60% are health research. About 10% of all of our studies are actually clinical trials. So we cannot afford, in any business or institutional sense, to distort our systems to manage clinical research, because it will disadvantage, or could potentially disadvantage, our other work. Laurel has given a nice summary of national harmonization efforts, and I've recapped a little bit of that here. We did not actually, try and coordinate our presentations. And what's super interesting about the harmonization efforts is that they have, by and large, been driven by or focused on clinical research, specifically clinical trials. They've been driven by researchers and clinicians who are, without question, interested in better care for their patients. I'm not disputing the intent, but they've been driven by people who, including clinical trial sponsors, who are very, very interested in really rapid approvals in order to get research underway, and who are not responsible for or engaged in administration of institutional obligations. As recently as 2020, Health Canada convened several pan-Canadian meetings related to streamlined and single REB review of COVID studies. And rumors persist that CIHR might one day mandate reviews of some research by a single REB. And I have to say that would be beyond CIHR's authority and would be a super interesting discussion if it happened. But at those Health Canada pan-Canadian meetings, all of the attendees, and Laurel, Susan Marlin, and I were all on those calls, we all said, no, it is not possible in this context to implement single board review, because we knew that local conditions, in particular the REB's interactions with the health authorities and the hospitals, would be vitally important. I would say at this point that the CIHR Stem Cell Oversight Committee, and I am very proud to be in my 7th year serving on that committee, is the closest we have ever come to a national REB And its reviews occur in addition to local REB reviews. So that's, and Richard has already talked about the legislative, provincial legislation, and these are not insignificant barriers to harmonization. So what is really interesting about all the national harmonization efforts is that they have all focused on a single national REB that sits apart from the PIs and the institutions it would support. So instead of reducing the number of REBs, we add an REB. And that REB would require, would have to be created and maintained, which will come at a cost. And Clinical Trials Ontario benefits from sustained or ongoing and significant funding from the province of Ontario, and other provinces have invested in different ways. But I don't hear anybody stepping up to single-handedly support a national REB. So none of these initiatives have succeeded because, in addition to the financial and organizational challenges, I would say they have not addressed how centrally provided ethics review processes would be integrated with or support institutional responsibilities, the responsibilities that are handed to us by the tri-agencies and which we have fully taken up. I would also point out that from a researcher point of view, moving to a national REB will typically require that researchers will then have to work in a minimum of 2 systems, unless they only ever do one type of research. And you might reflect on the experience of any of the cancer researchers you know, because if they do cancer research and any other kind of research, they are working in 2 systems most of the time. And this is, the point is we don't have to do that, right? This is the point of REBEX and our harmonization initiatives. So I want to shift now from sort of an institutional macroscopic perspective to more of an REB perspective. There are a number of issues related to multi-jurisdictional research that I think REBs and our colleagues at the Secretariat are still seeking to better understand or define. So we know that involvement in a multi-jurisdictional study can take many different forms. It's not thus, it's unlike a clinical trial, and that's where a lot of our modeling comes from. Unlike a clinical trial, multi-jurisdictional grant-funded research, you could have all kinds of activities and engagements across sites. You could have collaborators added at different points in a study. The research activities, the participant populations may vary site to site. Investigators may assume very different responsibilities. There's a myriad of possibilities there. And so whenever I see templated agreements or sort of prescribed processes, I worry because they will, they may address some portions of our business extremely well, but they will not likely address all of our business. And so I was taught a long time ago by a very smart project manager, and Stacey Beck knows this really well. What we're looking for are solutions that address at least 80% of our business, so that management of exceptions becomes a part-time activity, not a full-time activity, right? There's a couple of other things around multi-jurisdictional research that I think also need to be talked about, and I'll dig into these a little bit more. Whether or not the activity is research. We know that one REB's program review is another REB's ethics review. We know, or it's a program evaluation versus research, right? We know that some REBs have, for them, something that is a delegated review will become a full board review elsewhere. And you know, there's educational and awareness and other issues there that perhaps need to be addressed. But I think there's also issues around how we build trusted relationships, the way that BC in particular has done. There's some interesting questions about duration of ethics approval. The TCPS does not stipulate when ethics approval should end. And so these sorts of issues are challenging or need to be considered in the case of standalone single site studies. And they will become even blurrier with multi-jurisdictional research and will demand even better communication, right? 2 areas in particular that I think really need some examination by tri-agencies and by institutions. And one is around research data and its uses. So the tri-agency's policy on research data management and effectively the immortalization of human participant data is going to raise real questions for REBs about continuing review and collaboration. Because we understand that researchers are supposed to submit ethics applications prior to access to data. Now, we understand that, lots of researchers don't. Or collection of human biological materials. I still have conversations with researchers saying, yes, in fact, if you're using biological materials, you have to submit an ethics approval. This is still news to people. So we need to think better about these issues. We need to think more about what happens in terms of the continuing review if a study involves only data or human biological materials. And Stacey just pointed out that 20% of the REB studies don't involve participants. So we know that there's a tremendous desire for better national data projects, and we know we can support them. We need to understand better when we say, no, you don't need to continue to submit for annual review. Then there's a whole area of commercialization and tech transfer. And this is something that funders, governments, and institutions are really, really interested on. It could be social innovation, it could be in STEM. It touches all research domains. And the question I ask, particularly now with social media and the internet and all kinds of connectivity, is how do we sever a PI's commercial or private for-profit activities from their institutionally overseen academic research? At what point, as we incubate these enterprises, at what point do we say, this is no longer university research, this is outside of the REB's mandate? Because we don't, so this becomes very, very challenging when you have PIs with startup companies who obtain CIHR funding and they're doing research that's intended to commercialize, and now they have another external partner. It gets very gray very, very quickly. And any of you who've worked with this will understand that. I know for certain that most REBs are not interested in more work. I know that all REBs are actually interested in and committed to advancing ethical research as expeditiously and as efficiently as possible. I believe most REBs already rely on one another's reviews as much as they possibly can. Some institutions have been willing to basically outsource their reviews. They rely on other institutions. My office is privileged to provide review services for several institutions here in Alberta. Others have adopted conjoint REBs. So over time, people have found ways of reducing the burden and reducing barriers. One of the core issues, though, related to single review is that in order for a local REB to accept or rely on the review of any other REB is that we have to know about it. It has to be put in front of us. And so we're back to researchers making local applications. The question then is, what is the difference between local consideration and acknowledgement and a delegated review? There is also laterally an issue around indemnification of the research by the institutions. And I just wanted to note in passing that in Western Canada, a lot of that indemnification flows through Curie, which is not the case for research hospitals in Eastern Canada, right? Now, I'm repeating a lot of the things or touching on a lot of the things that some of the other speakers have already addressed. And I think what I want everybody here to think about is not so much single review, but simpler review. How can we harness and leverage the work we've already done? How can we take all of our experience working together in BC, or the work that the U of A and the U of C have done, the work that UBC, U of A, and Saskatchewan have done around, we have reciprocity agreement that's been in place since 2011, I think. So we've done all of this work, and we should not abandon that work. We should continue to build on it. And I believe, I am absolutely a REBX champion. I believe REBX offers us the technical solution that supports institutional requirements, advances individual studies, supports researchers, and it's going to let us connect the West and in time the East. I don't believe we need to move, nor should we move, to a single point of REB review, because a single REB situated in another city or another province cannot understand local considerations. And if we think broadly about the research we do, if we think in a very big picture way, if we're going to do meaningful work with Indigenous communities, if we're going to respectfully engage with particular participant groups, if we're going to address local operational concerns, then we need to be able to provide that local review. So couple of comments or suggestions to our friends and colleagues at the Secretariat. The proposed guidance that's coming in 2023 is going to be great. It doesn't get us around provincial legislation, but I think there are ways we can streamline those processes we already have with REBX. I would encourage the Secretariat to consider defining types of multi-jurisdictional research activities or research activities, period, that might be exempt from REB review. So, well, this is, I think, is actually predominantly multi-jurisdictional research. So collaborations where local researchers only have access to anonymized data, and notice I say anonymized and not anonymous. Perhaps where researchers are contributing to research design and so on. I would also say that the tri-agencies really need to consider mandatory training for researchers about all their responsibilities, not just about financial obligations. That is too narrow a focus, and it leaves groups like REBs struggling to educate researchers about their obligations far too late in a research process. I believe that we can move to enduring national harmonization. I believe that a solution for multi-jurisdictional studies like REB review needs to be proportionate and principle-based, and it must support individual and institutional accountabilities without compromising local processes and considerations. Most importantly, that solution needs to support all human participant research, not just clinical trials, not pediatric trials, not just health research. It needs to support all human participant research. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And my slides will be available. I believe everybody's slides will be.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was extremely interesting and very articulate. You and I are on the same page, but you say it way, way better than I do. So for last speaker, we will have Terry Fleming, who, as I know all of you know, would like to just bring up a proposal pertaining to the BC Harmonization Initiative and perhaps simplifying our review process. Terry?
Thanks, I lost you on my screen. I apologize for that. So I'm just going to share my screen here and pick the right one to share. Okay, I'm hoping that everybody can see my slides and that they're in the appropriate format and not presenter view. Anyone gonna give me a nod or a thumbs up? Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. Okay. So I get the pleasure of trying to follow on from everyone today, but I want to start with, first of all, my name is Terry Fleming. I'm the Director for Research Ethics BC, and but I also wanted to say that I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of Lower Vancouver Island, and particularly relevant to the nations that are Songhees, the Wasanic, and the Esquimalt peoples. And I'm a very grateful visitor to these lands, and it is lovely to be able to be here. It is a sunny day here where I am, and I'm hoping later that I get to take advantage of how well these nations have taken care of our lands, and try to do something with my garden, because as Laurel said, we haven't had summer yet, so I'm still working on that. But my presentation today is really talking about taking everything back from where we started with Hanan at the beginning and talking about the guidance, but bringing us full circle and talking a little bit more back to the BC and the models that we use here, and how I think it might be a good time for us to make a change, and why I think that that's relevant. So first of all, Hanan presented to us that the proposed guidance is being reviewed. It will be adjusted slightly based on feedback during the consultation. But right now, it would see us use a model where all minimal risk studies would have a review by a single REB. The Board of Record would conduct the review similar to the model we use here. And if the other REB notes local considerations or something they feel the REB of Record should consider, they bring it to the attention of the REB of Record. And the intent, I think, is really to avoid creating unique versions of the approved documents, depending on the institution. And the local or involved REB would accept the REB of Record's review. And this model, this model would clearly state that the agreements about accepting the review in another REB would not be required. And as Susan mentioned, that'll be a very welcome change to move away from requiring those agreements. So moving on to how this looks with our models. So what we've had in place with a reciprocity agreement since 2013. Unfortunately, it expired in 2018, but we were moving to the electronic platform at that time. It was originally signed by 12 institutions, and it launched the BC Ethics Harmonization Initiative. The agreement specified what the requirements were for each REB, such as being a TCPS2 compliant REB that could hold funds, having policies and procedures in place to conduct ethical reviews, and commitment to finding a streamlined approach to multi-jurisdictional research. It outlined maximal reciprocity as a goal. And although the original reciprocity agreement did expire, we still operate using these principles for our harmonized platform for 22 research ethics boards. And we're all using those same principles on the harmonized reviews that are conducted now. And taking our time and using pilots allowed us to develop trust across the institutions, and resulted in institutions defining how they could apply the levels of reciprocity in the review process. So from the policy of the UBC Behavioral Research Ethics Board, which is used by several other institutions in the network, direct reciprocity, and this was mentioned by others, accepts the review of another Tri-Council policy compliant REB. Some circumstances where this is applied by the REB offices include when the study is not even being conducted at your site. The other REB has the vast majority of jurisdiction for oversight of the participants or data, and could be that the only involvement of another institution is through team affiliations. Another one is the application for secondary use of data, again, just referred to by Susan. Or the study itself is very minimal risk, and your researcher may be involved in recruitment of local participants, but the research is not planned, it is not intended to put them in a vulnerable situation, and so it is considered very low risk. So I'm thinking of an example like a questionnaire about campus life. So partial review is where some risk is involved, but still overall minimal risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the full review is where your REB is designated as the Board of Record, or the study is above minimal risk for local participants and another REB is appointed as the Board of Record. So at this time, I do not have the data to be able to tell you how many minimal risk studies that are harmonized already employed this practice of full reciprocity by giving another REB the authority to do the review on their behalf during the harmonized process. But if I did, would I create more confidence that this is not such a big change that I'm going to propose? So let me show you the potential by the numbers. So basically, I looked at the numbers from October 2021, and we had in the system 1,119 harmonized active studies. So these are just the harmonized ones, which means this is, this is not the ones that are done under a single jurisdiction for each of the various institutions. Like I said, there's 22 of them in there. But this is just harmonized, and 72% of the minimal risk studies were only between two REBs, or what we called a dyad relationship, for a very long time. So that really works out to being about 626 studies were just between two institutions. And then if we actually break that down a little bit further and talk about the behavioral side of things, and these are behavioral studies that are minimal risk, 70% of the behavioral studies are between only two research ethics boards. That's quite a large number in our harmonized system. But unfortunately, by the very nature of our harmonized review for minimal risk, we have defaulted to a partial review a lot of the time. Too often, the additional provisos can appear purely administrative and may not add actual value to the ethics review. And we heard some examples yesterday afternoon from our group of community-based researchers. Some examples were like policies or practices about the use of logos and requirements for the local REB, and a variety of reporting phone lines to be listed on the consent form. I propose that in BC, because we've been working so closely together for so long on collaborative reviews, the trust is there that would allow for us to move to a review by a single REB for minimal risk studies. And what would this model look like? Simple, remove step 5. All else would remain the same in our model. We would still be using the same system. The algorithm would still determine the best board of record for this study. The REBs would still be involved if there was a discussion about whether it was minimal risk or not. The board of record would conduct the review, and they would hit the harmonize button in the platform so that the other REBs could see it, but they wouldn't actually start to do another review, even if it was just a small review, because it's minimal risk, and we're all following the same guidelines for the ethical review. Some examples when I think this can apply, that we could apply this immediately, are studies that do not have local recruitment, as I mentioned earlier in another slide. There's no local recruitment at your site. The application is for secondary use of data or for a previously approved study. And then there is another option that I'm suggesting, and this is where we apply only an admin review when there is a minimal risk local recruitment, such as posters for recruitment to participate in study remotely or at another location, and it does not require any resources to be utilized at your site. Or where there is local recruitment, but the participants are not going to be made vulnerable by the conduct of the study. And in lieu of when we get around to having this changed formally, as Susan was asking for, this could be an option for us that would reduce some of the workload for the research ethics boards. So I pose to our REBs here today that we are probably doing this a lot of the time anyway. I can't demo that because it's not a field that I can run a report on from the RISE platform. But if we did a sample of those minimal risk dyad studies, what percentage would already be using full reciprocity as the default harmonized review method? By fully accepting this adjustment to the minimal risk model, we would reinvigorate our original intention of streamlining the process for researchers to mobilize their studies faster and increase the trust in BC research ethics, including harmonization models within the research community. And wouldn't it be nice to free up some valuable time at your REB to invite in the researchers on more complex issues, to present their proposals, have a conversation with them about their intentions and their experience in the area? And like this was proposed by our speakers yesterday, they all recognize that there's no capacity in our current system for that approach, but by taking this small step, we would be able to put our resources to better use on harmonization of the more complex studies. So I know there are a couple areas where we might get stuck, where everybody gets stuck. Defining or coming to agreement on minimal risk. We really shouldn't, because there is clear guidance. It was mentioned by several times today. And Hanan read it out to us, which is very kind. But what is the variation between institutions on acceptable level of risk that may not be fully related to ethics? So, and then there's another one where we might have some area to talk about, which is protection of local participants. What circumstances require the eyes of a local research ethics board to really assess the ethical considerations for local participants? Are those sometimes operational or institutional requirements or policies? And then, as I mentioned, defining when it's a vulnerable population, that we need to find that balance and really remember that it's about defining not a vulnerable population, but rather what circumstances in the research proposed could potentially result in participants being vulnerable. So I have no absolute conclusions because we have a collaborative model in BC. And I hope that this has given some food for thought to our research ethics boards here who work on minimal risk behavioral studies. And maybe we can continue this conversation after the conference, but I look forward to your questions. Oh, Laurel, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Terry. That was a great way to wrap up and left us with a lot to think about at the local level. Where I do agree with you, I think that that a lot of what you're proposing is stuff that we're actually already doing, and we just don't have the data to evidence that it is actually being done. So certainly from UBC's perspective, I think that there would be a positive consideration of your recommendation. Okay, so we're now to a period of time where we have roughly half an hour for questions. Rachel, are they going to come in through the chat, or how had we managed to coordinate the questions?
They're coming in they're coming in through the chat.
Okay, so put your questions in the chat and we'll take them as they come in. And then I have a few more if there aren't a lot coming through.
I think Susan has one.
Oh, Susan's hand up. Okay, Susan, your hand's up.
Actually, it's not so much a question as a comment. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that in all of the in the models that Terry, that you have, that you've built in BC, Laurel, that we have with Saskatchewan and our reciprocity agreement, and that U of A and U of C have built with REB and what Stacey has described, is that none of these models obligate an REB to do anything. REBs retain choice, right? They retain an ability to say, yeah, we would love to accept your review and we can't, right? And I think to go back to this notion of trust building and the challenge that Terry has just proposed is, if we really look at our practices and how we've evolved over time, there are a lot of things that we used to be hypervigilant about and we can now relax about because we have moved from form to substance, right? We've moved away from checklist compliance. Okay, there's still some REBs out there that do that. I just encountered one the other day and I was like, you must be kidding, but whatever. That REB will also evolve in time, right? And so I think this is really important to keep in mind, is that we can choose and we can start with the simple pieces and move towards the complicated health interventions and clinical trials, right? Anyway, I'll stop there.
No, totally agree. Great comment. I'm looking for any other questions. Nobody out there? Okay, to follow up then with that topic, Susan and Hanan, my question coming from a legal background is that while we all sort of appreciate the fact that we don't need an agreement with respect to the multi-jurisdictional model, our experience has been that an overarching agreement is actually not a bad thing to start with, because the overarching agreement between all the different players in the harmonization place allows them to what we called play in the sandbox. So we did not describe a particular model that we had to use. We gave people the option to participate or not to participate, but we had an overarching agreement that basically set out the principles for what we were trying to do, set out the fact that we were trying to arrive at maximal reciprocity, etc., and gave us room to play in the field. And as Terry's pointed out, at this point, that agreement has been lapsed. And in fact, the UBC Western harmonization agreement with U of A and U of S has also lapsed, but we're still playing the game. So I'm just wondering if there might be some consideration of whether or not some sort of initial agreement that basically sets out the standards or the principles might be something that might give some boards and some institutions a bit of confidence that that this is okay and that they can go ahead and give it a try. Hanan? Yeah, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah.
There you are.
Yes. Well, I think that starting with the fact that with minimal risk, we're hoping that institutions will not, there will not be a lot of resistance within institutions because of the fact that it is minimal risk. And as you said, that and we've heard this over and over again, that institutions have been collaborating, and there's a lot of trust, and there's a lot of so I mean, I think that there is some institutions will still want to have those agreements, and that's okay. It's still optional, right? But it's I think with time, that's the vision that you've from a legal perspective. I don't think that there will be a lot of resistance to this approach, and I think that's part of the that's why part of the scope of the whole guidance is limited to minimal risk research at this stage. It's like when we started with COVID and everyone was working online, and many organizations said that you cannot work online, or you cannot telework all the time outside the office, and we've proven that this works, right? So I think that it will take time, but and that's why we want to assess this in a couple of years, as I mentioned, so to see whether those guidelines will have an impact. And honestly, I think that the agencies will strongly encourage institutions to adopt. It's not mandatory, but they will strongly encourage institutions to adopt those streamlining, especially for minimal risk research at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
Thank you. I agree with everything Hanan said, and I want to point out a couple of other things. You know, Richard, you emphasized a couple of times that agreements are between institutions, not between REBs, and the TCPS actually says that institutions should consult with their REBs about these agreements. But you're absolutely right. Institutions enter into agreements, not REBs. The other thing that both CHEER and CTO and other efforts have focused on has been this sort of REB certification process, which I will note is not required in the TCPS. And I would also note that if we think about all of the common ground we already have, we can maybe step away from agreements. We are all TCPS2 compliant. We are all signatories to the tri-agency agreement. We all abide by the RCR framework for the conduct of research, right? So we as institutions, and for those of us who administer US funds, we all hold an FWA. So if you think about it, we all subscribe to the same frameworks, the same principles, the same processes. We are upholding the same standards. And what we have are really idiosyncratic local processes or requirements, or frankly, individual personal lenses on things that as well as consideration for local requirements that gives variation in our process. But fundamentally, we're all in the same business. We're all committed to the same things. And I think we need to, as institutions and as REBs, we need to keep that common ground firmly in mind. We need to go, yeah, you're right. We're already we're using the same song sheet. So do we need more agreements with one another to say that we're TCPS compliant and we hold a tri-agency agreement? No, we don't. We are already all in the same game, right? So I would say that we don't actually need REB certification if we're doing all of these other things, because what are we doing? We're proving that we're already, why do we need to prove to another party when we've satisfied tri-agency that we're meeting their requirements, right?
Richard, do you want to respond?
I think that I mean, there are many ways to look at that. I don't think that we have proven to the tri-agency that we are implementing their requirements. I think that the tri-agency is asking us to implement the requirements, which is a different thing. When I was dealing with the government of Quebec a few years ago, they wanted, because in Quebec, you do have a system of designation by the ministry. And this is very demanding in terms of what kind of reports you're going to provide to the government. And when I was talking with the department, they said, we receive a lot of information from every site. However, we would like to make sure by having an on-site visit that it is actually the case. That was their stance. Okay, so yes, I mean we all abide by the same things. We, as you say, you know, we have the same regulations, we have the same policy, we have the same FWA, we have the same thing. However, when we do site visits, we always find things that are not perfect, but it's not that demanding, you know, those qualification visits, it's not that demanding. And it's always an opportunity to learn, both from the side of the visitors and those from the side of those who are receiving the visit. So this is a way to kind of make sure that that every site is on top of things, and that you can trust that they are going to do a good thing, reviewing something on behalf of your institution.
Just to play devil's advocate there, Richard, when Stacey and I spoke to people in the United States, I was very surprised to find out that accreditation was not part of the piece, and that they only required a minimal amount of self-assessment to say that a board was capable of being the board of record as a single IRB review in the United States. So they don't have, although they have a very robust accreditation process, they don't have a requirement within the single IRB rule that the board of record that is the single board be qualified in any sort of way aside from sort of a self-attestation. And that's again where their reliance agreements come in, because they follow up with it in that way, but there is no accreditation process for the single IRB qualification.
Yeah, there's no accreditation requirement. I think that in the US, they have adopted the model that was very costly in terms of time and money for accreditation, and that this is not the model that was proposed, or that is actually the case with the qualification program. You can look at a number of countries, whether it is Australia, whether it is the UK, whether it is Netherlands, and you've got different situations in every country. So what is going to be the case in Canada, we'll see. But I think that if we are talking about, trusting each other, about working together, we have to decide what is going to be the basis for that, what is going to be the threshold for that, and then we can decide which way we want to go.
Okay, fair enough. Eugenie, do you have a question, or has Susan already answered it in the chat?
Oh, yeah, I think Susan answered it. I don't know if Susan would like to add more or not.
So, sorry, Eugenie's posed a question about the U of A providing reviews for other institutions. I'm happy to speak to it. I've not answered it. So there's a couple of different things that we do. Because of the designation requirement in Alberta, any research involving use of health information as defined in the Health Information Act must be reviewed by an REB so designated for that purpose by the minister. So there's only 3 REBs that do that, and that change came in about 2011. And so a couple of institutions that had designated REBs, had that designation, lost designation, but they still did health research. And so we offered at that point, we said, we will review your health research for you. So we entered very specific designation agreements or reciprocity agreements, and their studies come in via our online system, and responsibility for the conduct of the research and for oversight of the research rests with the home institution. So these institutions, Eugenie, to your point, are not necessarily doing clinical research, right? They're doing health research, and they may be working with, I would say in general, they're not working with patient populations. So they are not running Health Canada regulated clinical trials. However, we have in Alberta, and this is, it's funny, we don't talk about this enough, but in Alberta, when the TCPS, in the run up to the implementation of the TCPS in 1998, we used to have REBs in every single hospital. And the hospitals were independent. And the hospitals looked around and they said, this is too many REBs. And so University of Calgary went through this process, or led this process in Calgary, and U of A led it in Edmonton. And we took all of the hospital REBs in each of those cities and we consolidated them. And we created in Edmonton, and I won't speak to Calgary, but I know Stacey Page is in the audience, and that Stacey's between them might want to talk about this. But in Edmonton, we established the Health Research Ethics Board that the U of A administers. It is actually a conjoint health research board or ethics board for the U of A, Alberta Health Services now, and Covenant Health, which is our faith-based health organization, healthcare organization. So we review all clinical research for AHS in Northern Alberta, basically, as well as U of A research involving AHS facilities. So we eliminated those dual reviews a long time ago. More recently, other institutions have come to the U of A for different reasons and have said, we are struggling to maintain an REB. We have a very relatively low volume of studies. Would you be our board? And so we've entered into essentially a fee for services arrangement with a couple of different institutions. And these are predominantly, so they're doing generally minimal risk research, and it's typically, again, not clinical trials. So could we review, but however, we do review clinical trials for AHS. The interesting thing, Eugenie, is that in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it is quite ordinary for clinical research to be driven through an academic institution. And I think the landscape is different in BC, because if that research, I suspect, is flowing mostly through the hospitals and the health authorities. So I hope that's answered your question. I'm happy to follow up privately if you want more details on how that works.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I have one that's kind of a bit odd, but Hanan, I'm wondering why now? Why did the panel decide to introduce the proposal for minimal risk single REB review at the time that it did, like the past December. It just, was there some thinking behind the decision? What prompted the determination that you should go forward with this proposal?
It's a good question. Well, we've been receiving, as you know, we're open to receiving interpretation questions on an ongoing basis, and so we've received questions about lots of questions about multi-jurisdictional research. At the same time, the agencies themselves have been receiving researchers in the community have been, some researchers in the community have raised concerns about some of the delays and some of the duplication of reviews that they have to go through, and so it came from different angles, let's put it this way, and it pushed basically this priority to this topic to the top of the priority list for the panel to address it.
Okay, thank you. Following up on that, Richard, your tier program or tier grant focuses strictly on ethical review of multi-site pediatric studies, and you have not tried to tackle the issues which all the rest of us, everyone knows are also part of the issue, which is contracts, privacy, and institutional approvals. Before the determination was made that you should work on single REB review as the priority, was there any assessment done of the relative impact of those barriers compared to the ethics review process? In other words, was ethics review determined to be the primary problem, or was there any comparison done with the other barriers?
I think that we all know that ethics review used to be the slowest part of the approval, but it's not the case anymore in an institution. It is the contract very often that is delaying approval. Now, having been, as you said, in the field for a long time, it has been an interest from federal government. First, an interest that I think was misplaced, to have a central REB in Canada. And I said, you're out of your mind. First, you cannot impose that because of the Constitution. And second, you don't want to fund that because it's going to be extremely expensive to fund that. So that's not, it is a non-starter. But this discussion of a single REBs comes back from time to time, and it did come back at the time of COVID. And I said, no, you don't want to do that. You cannot do that. It's a non-starter. So that is something that, to try to have as few approval as possible, has been a preoccupation of Health Canada for a long time, for decades. Okay, that's not new. The second thing that is not new is to have a certain reassurance about the ability of an REB to review a clinical trial. And you will remember that in the 2001 regulation, when they were issued, there was a preamble. And in the preamble, it did state that Health Canada and CIHR at the time, or it was maybe the MRC, I don't know, at the time it was issued, were in discussion about accreditation. And it simply did not happen because of 9/11. That's why it did not happen. Everything got derailed, and it never had the window of opportunity that it had at that time. So it is a preoccupation to have those two things that have been with Health Canada and CIHR and MRC for a long time. So that's not new.
We have a question from Sandra Broughton. If accreditation was put in place, would there be consequences to not be accredited? And would that then potentially imply that we have levels of REBs accredited and not? Would this then in BC impact the trust and collaboration that has been built? So the Sanders worrying about the potential outcomes, but also speaks to the benefits of engaging in accreditation. Does anyone want to take that one on?
I guess that, you know, my experience with all of those things is that, I mean, when you go on a site and you go on a qualification visit, you work until it is a qualified site. You don't let the site down. You work until it is a qualified site. And if it's not a site that can qualify, I can tell you it should not review research, you know, with children, because they would be no good. But I cannot conceive of any of the 6 pediatric hospitals that cannot meet the requirements, because of, as was said, we are all following the same rigorous policies and regulations. I mean, you would have to have a very dysfunctional site for a site not to be accredited or qualified. So I don't know. I don't know about the experience of countries that have accreditation. How many sites really failed accreditation? It can take some time, but how many failed? I would be very surprised if there was a high level of failure.
I would think that's sort of a counter argument to the whole proposal. And my concerns are a lot around extra bureaucracy that was added, and the cost to the institutions. That if it was really proven to have some effectiveness, that would be one thing. But just because it's a good idea that allows us on paper to think that we're all doing the same thing at the same time, I just don't know. Susan? You're muted.
Okay, there I am. I want to go back to my comments about regional perspective, right? We have to understand that in the US, in the UK, just about, well, I would say everywhere in the world, and certainly in Canada, all of the efforts to streamline ethics review have come out of the clinical domain, right? And not surprisingly, they default to standards and practices that are common to clinical trials, i.e. site visits, accreditation. I don't know, Linda Longpre said something about fireproof filing cabinets. Standards that may be relevant as sort of a site from the perspective of a sponsor monitoring sites in a clinical trial. And I do not believe that we should be building systems that are specific to or built around the requirements for our highest risk, most complicated research, because that's not where the volume of our business is, right? And so, Richard, I think this is one of the challenges that CHEER faces, that CTO faces.
You're frozen.
You froze out, Susan.
The most complex, highest risk research, rather than starting the way the harmonization efforts have started with minimal risk, low risk dyad type studies, right? And I believe very strongly that we should not impose biomedical review requirements on all of our human participant research.
Well,
I'm mindful of the time. Terry, do you have any last minute things you want to say?
Oh, I was just collecting volunteers for a committee to review how we're going to put in place the new guidance. So anyway, no last minute comments for me as part of this panel, just that I've just found it really interesting to get, the overview of macro level down to, how it relates to institutions, and then how we might be able to make change locally. I found that personally, I'm hoping that's where we can go right away in BC, along with REBX. So that's very exciting. But from a REB West perspective, this is our last session, and we should be closing out. We're running a little bit over time for this one, but just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to everyone that has been part of REB West over the last day and a half. We're hoping to see everybody in person next year, and that we will be able to do this in a different type of format. I don't know if we'll even be able to do that anymore. Does anybody know how to stand up and present? So it should be really interesting. But we have a survey that'll be going out to everybody that registered for the event. And we'll send that survey out and make sure that we get your feedback and any ideas obviously for future events, and any ideas on future speakers. We would really appreciate that too. But to our speakers that joined us today, first of all, Laurel, thank you for moderating. Fantastic as always, and for being very topical and making us think about things. For Stacey and Susan for joining us from that distant province of Alberta, and for Hanan and Richard for joining us from even more distant. And thank you for joining us from that eastern part of Canada. And so thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.